Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded on May 27, 2014, Daniel and I spoke with Dr. Ivan Eland about his 2008 book, Recarving Rushmore, Ranking the Presidents on Peace, Prosperity, and Liberty. This is part one of a two-part series. Dr. Eland is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute, and previously served as Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He has written articles for many different publications and has appeared on numerous television programs, including ABC's World News Tonight and CNN's Crossfire. You can follow his work on Twitter at Ivan_Eland. That's IVAN_ELAND, and through his archives on the Independent Institute's website, which is independent.org, antiwar.com, and the Huffington Post. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/presidents.
Please briefly explain how your approach to evaluating U.S. presidents differs from that of other presidential historians.
Well, my book, which has just been updated and will come out in the fall, and also the previous version, tried to evaluate presidents on the basis of how the founders might have done it. And it used peace, prosperity, and liberty as the categories of evaluation. And so I came up with much different ratings than normal historians, which on the left and on the right have a surprising degree of agreement. So that basis is if the president kept us at peace, as the founders wanted, if the president created the opportunity for the private sector to fulfill the American dream of economic prosperity, that is allowing the people to make their own economic decisions, etc., economic liberty. That was the second criterion. And the third criterion was if the president stuck within the powers of the Constitution. And most presidents haven't done that. They've expanded their powers and their role, especially during wartime.
So I was wondering, in terms of the ranking, when it comes down to the more specifics, did you kind of give a weight to the policy decisions that they made and then kind of rated them, I guess, mathematically, or was it done differently?
Well, it's a mathematical weight, but it's not a cardinal weighting, it's an ordinal rating. So each one of those three categories, peace, prosperity, and liberty, they were given a rating from 1 to 20. And that sort of gives me a ranking rather than some sort of a mathematical formula, which I think would be difficult to use. I did pay attention strictly to policy. I didn't include charisma or any of these other factors. For instance, Teddy Roosevelt was often fascinated historians because he was just so charismatic. But did his policies promote peace, prosperity, and liberty? I think you can argue that many of them didn't. And I think there's other presidents who fit into that category as well. So I stuck just with the policies. I don't care if they had extramarital affairs or what they did on their personal time. I just rated policies and whether the policies contributed to peace, prosperity, and liberty, and how the founders would have rated those policies.
Okay. Now, it looks like that method of evaluation produced some interesting conclusions. So how did you reach putting John Tyler, Grover Cleveland, and Martin Van Buren as the top three presidents in your ranking?
Well, of course, these guys weren't perfect either. No president is perfect, and no president got a perfect 60 rating. But the John Tyler and Grover Cleveland, Martin Van Buren, those types of presidents, they tended to operate in a laissez-faire manner, that is to say, a free market manner. Van Buren, for example, Van Buren's banking system was probably the best banking system that we've ever had. It was a free banking system, not in contrast to the Federal Reserve and all the regulations now. Grover Cleveland, he was, for the most part, a small government guy, and the last Democrat to be small government. The Democratic Party used to be the bastion of small government until the end of Grover Cleveland's second term towards the turn of the last century. So he was small government. He generally stayed out of foreign entanglements, although he had one in Venezuela. And then, of course, John Tyler, he went against his own party and got ousted essentially simply because although he had the Whig party label, he really was sort of a disaffected Democrat who had changed parties because he didn't like the tyranny of Andrew Jackson. He felt it didn't square with the small government ethos of the Democratic Party, so he switched parties. But of course, the Whig Party was also a big government party. But he went against that and tried to maintain small government. And both Van Buren and Tyler actively avoided wars that could have gotten into. And of course, that's what the big thing in American history. We always hear about the wars and the presidents who were in command during the wars, but we never even remember presidents who avoided war and kept the country at peace. And I think that's a big mistake in our evaluation of presidents.
So then we go to the other end of the spectrum, and we have Woodrow Wilson, who in normal rankings is normally not dead last like in yours. So how did you end up putting Woodrow Wilson at number 40?
Well, he's actually, in the new volume, he's 41 because I inserted Barack Obama in there. But yes, he still is dead last. And I say he ruined the 20th century, and now he's working on the 21st. I mean, the Iraq War was a remnant of World War I, and the way that came together after the U.S. had intervened on the side of Britain. And by entering World War I, which was totally unnecessary, it led to World War II and the Cold War. And I would argue that Woodrow Wilson actively started the Cold War after he and the Allies invaded Russia after the Bolsheviks took power. Now, certainly the Bolshevik, that wasn't a favorable development, as we all know, but I think that caused that. And of course, there was very little argument that World War I caused World War II. And our current foreign policy community, they go on this Munich 1938 that you should never appease anybody because aggression anywhere will snowball into worldwide conflagration. And they use Hitler as an example. But if we go back, the United States actively helped bring Hitler to power by Woodrow Wilson's behavior after entering the World War I, tipping the balance, because Germany probably would have won that war on a 15-round decision rather than a knockout, and the borders of Europe would have been adjusted as they had been for many wars in Europe, which the U.S. had stayed out of. But in this particular case, they rubbed Germany's nose in it, the reparations afterwards, and also Woodrow Wilson in particular let the Allies run roughshod over Germany so that he could get this League of Nations, which ended up falling through anyway, but he sort of bargained that off. Third thing he did was he insisted that the Kaiser abdicate. And of course, the Kaiser had a certain amount of power in Germany, and that opened the way for Hitler to take the supreme leadership role as Chancellor leading up to World War II, because there was nobody above the Chancellor to block him as there had been in World War I.
How much did the establishment of the Federal Reserve System and the ratification of the 16th Amendment play into that ranking for Wilson? Or was it mostly...
I think that was... talking about the income tax. The income tax was already there. It was ratified under Taft, but of course Wilson made good use of it. And in World War I, was the first time that the income tax became the dominant form of taxation in America. Previously, it had been taxes and tariffs and excise taxes. So Woodrow Wilson clearly had a role in bringing about the current tax regime in America. So that did count against him. And of course, the Federal Reserve Act happened during his watch as well. So yes, he's downgraded for all his domestic intervention, as well as being the most interventionist president probably in U.S. history in foreign policy. And I think World War I led to big government in the United States simply because everyone blames FDR, and certainly he does get some of the blame. But FDR was an assistant secretary of the Navy under Wilson, and he adopted the wartime model to fight the peacetime Great Depression. And a lot of the people and even the agencies were renamed that had been in World War I to come back during the Depression. So it was a wartime model that was used to increase government during the Great Depression and, of course, World War II. So although FDR was bad, he was taking the precedence from World War I. There was more intervention in the U.S. economy to fight World War I than had ever been previously, even during the Civil War, which had happened, 50 years before. So Woodrow Wilson, I think we can probably blame for the advent of permanent big government, in the U.S. at least.
Okay, then. So some other presidents who led the U.S. into unnecessary wars that you scored very poorly were William McKinley and James Polk. Now, a lot of people probably don't know much about them. So why did they come out so poorly in your system?
Well, William McKinley, of course, was responsible for the Spanish-American War in 1898. And it was really a useless colonial war. The U.S. had, because of its own victimization by colonialism, sort of stayed away from these types of things until the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War was really a small war with great significance because it was really the coming out party for the U.S. to be a global power. And it was also a colonial war. And so, that was the big problem there. They also, in saving this country, it was a bit like Vietnam. They destroyed the country to save it. They killed 200,000 Filipinos from disease and also from fighting and also torture. Polk, of course, tried to buy Mexico, part of Mexico, and the Mexicans refused to sell it. So he actively conspired to get them, provoke an incident, which he did by sending U.S. troops into a disputed area on the Texas-Mexican border. And actually, Mexicans had a better claim to where the border was than the U.S. did, but at the time. But of course, the Mexicans unfortunately took the bait, attacked U.S. troops, and the rest is history. I would argue that we not only provoked that incident, but we actively started the war by blockading the Rio Grande River before that. So a blockade is an act of war traditionally in international affairs. So most historians, I think, would say Polk deliberately provoked the war to steal the Mexican land. But I would say he probably went farther than that. He actively started the war by that blockade. But either way, started a war with a weaker country. And then, of course, he grabbed the territory, about half of Mexico, which became the American Southwest. So also, he was very belligerent toward the British, almost started another war simultaneously up in the Northwest, but they settled that, the border with the British, and he didn't go to war up there, but he was very belligerent in his actions there, and of course, that was became the Oregon Territory.
Yeah, I guess he had the 5440 or fight slogan.
Yes, so that was very aggressive. Of course, the border didn't end up at 5440. Because they ended up compromising with the British. But he was certainly pressing the British with belligerent statements and that sort of thing. So he could have easily, if the British had been more belligerent at the time, could have ended up with two wars at the same time, which would have been disaster. Madison was actually the only other president to almost do that in the War of 1812. But fortunately, we only fought one person. Madison is another one that's not rated very highly because he got into a useless war which got the U.S. Capitol burned. He's not one of the worst ones because he had a few positive aspects to his presidency. But whereas I would say Wilson, Truman, McKinley, and some of the ones that we've been the ones that we've been mentioning, they didn't really have too many good things happen in their presidency.
Okay, and Madison also had the invasion of Florida. But what sorts of good policies did he have that separated him a little bit from
Well, I think about the only war in history that really didn't have too many civil liberties violations was the War of 1812. Madison did have some sense that war caused these types of things, and he avoided doing that, which I think was a significant thing. Certainly the War of 1812 we can't say was a good thing at all. And Madison did some other bad things, but I think one of the things that, and Madison is still, I don't rate him very highly as a president, but I think what gets him a little higher than the rest of those is that his record on civil liberties during the war was pretty clean. And he did eventually settle the war with Britain, and of course, it was so much of a draw because, and it wasn't worth the whole mess. But he did negotiate an end to the war as well. So, although he didn't, I don't think he's a very good president. He's certainly probably above the ones that we were just mentioning.
So, one president that, if you say liberty to most people, they think of would be Thomas Jefferson. Why does he rank 26th, which is surprisingly low to people who might not think about things like this?
Well, I think, people were all suckers for rhetoric. If you go down to the Jefferson Memorial, you'll see all of his rhetoric. You go to the other monuments of people who gave great speeches and that sort of thing. And certainly Thomas Jefferson does get credit for the Declaration of Independence, although he pirated much of that from George Mason and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. So certainly, rhetorically, Jefferson was for liberty. One of the problems that Jefferson had was he was quite the hypocrite on most things, slavery being one of them, I think. But when he ruled, he didn't follow the Constitution in the Louisiana Purchase. His actions with the Barbary pirates, those came pretty close to being unconstitutional. And of course, one of the greatest police state actions in U.S. history was his draconian enforcement of the disastrous embargo against the British. And he had a chance to settle what became the War of 1812 with the British impressments. In 1806, he had a chance to settle that, and he didn't take it because he was indignant that the British were doing this. And instead of getting a negotiated settlement, which would have been smart for a weak country like the U.S. to do against Great Britain, which was the most powerful country in the world, he declined to do that. So I think and that laid the seeds for the embargo and the war, which didn't happen until Madison's time. So I think he really botched that, and I think he wasn't a very good president overall. Now he did. I don't rate him in the very bottom because he did reduce government at least somewhat, and that counts for something. But all his other actions kind of ballooned big government, like he expanded the Louisiana Purchase, and he deliberately didn't get any approval to do that, and he knew that he should have done it by some of the statements that he made. So I think these types of things, where he was a very of the three presidents in the 18th or the 19th century who were very activist and really strengthened the executive branch way past what the founders had intended, were Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln. And if you want to count McKinley towards the end there, but I think even McKinley's wasn't quite as bad as the other three. And so Jefferson was one of those activist presidents. He used the presidential power very forcefully, and he probably exceeded what the Constitution was. There's no probably about it. He did exceed what the Constitution mandated.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned in your book relating to Jefferson was his handling of the Native American question, I guess we could say.
Yes. Thanks for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that. I mean, he kind of pioneered the let's push them out, take their land, and we'll give them some land further west. And of course, he didn't mind using armed force to do that. And this set the model for the Trail of Tears under Jackson and Van Buren. And incidentally, although I think Van Buren was a very good president, I do downgrade him for Indians. And number 4, Rutherford B. Hayes, those guys would have been 1 and 2 if they hadn't had poor Indian policies. But Jefferson really started this idea of pushing the Indians out, taking their land, and pushing them further west. And this was, of course, we just kept doing it until they're now on reservations. And of course, it's very poor land. It's land that no one else wanted. And this is how. So Jefferson really helped set the Indian policy for the rest of U.S. history.
Now, were there any presidents that were better on Indian policy? I guess John Tyler was president when the Second Seminole War ended. So would he count? Are there any other presidents?
Yeah. I think Grant. Some people count Grant, although the Little Bighorn happened under Grant. I think Grant had good intentions because he had been involved with some of the Indian thing. He had been a general and that sort of thing, and he was fairly benevolent for that. But on the other hand, after the Little Bighorn massacre, all hell broke loose, and they were, and that leaked into Rutherford B. Hayes's term, which I dock him for as well. But I think Grant had this idea that they could be assimilated some way, but even that's sort of paternalistic, I guess, by our modern standards. But I think Grant at least had some intention of being better on Indian policy, because he thought that up to that point the Indians had really been given the short end of the stick, which of course they had. But I think in the end, I'm not sure he did much better than anybody else did. I think Grover Cleveland also was trying to do that, but he, over the Oklahoma Territory, I'm not sure he did much better. There were all overwhelming pressure lobbies from settlers and stuff, and the Indians really didn't have any voice in Congress at all to speak of. So despite their intentions, I'm not sure that they were really much better. I think more or less that's one thing you can say probably over American history, is that no president really shines too much in the way of that. Tyler did settle the Second Seminole War, which is really big, probably the biggest war in Indian war in U.S. history. So I think that maybe Tyler's one, but the U.S. Policy toward Indians by all presidents, I would say, or at least the vast majority of them, wasn't very good.
Okay, so on to a slightly more controversial figure. I know whenever most presidential contenders run for president, they're asked who is their favorite president, and I think the most frequent answer is probably Abraham Lincoln. So on your ranking, you got 29th. How did he end up so low? Or I guess it's kind of in the middle, but still, compared to most people.
The problem with saying it's in the middle is I have a lot more bad presidents than good presidents. He's listed as a bad president.
Yeah.
And so, and I mean, he's a demigod. If there's any president, he and Washington are the demigods. You can make a case that George Washington was a pretty good president, and I do. I rank him 7th. But Lincoln, he was really thirsting for war, I think, because he made almost no attempts to really settle the war. He felt that he had won the presidency, and that if he made any sort of deal with the South, why did they have an election? But he overlooked, of course, that in this time of sectional strife, there were 4 candidates, and he won, but only because the Democratic Party fractured. And so he really didn't have a mandate. But his idea was that the Republicans had won the election, and therefore there was going to be no expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Now that sounds like a good idea now, and of course when you criticize Lincoln, you fight the idea that you're some sort of a closet racist or something. But my family's from a Quaker background, so I kind of criticized Lincoln from the other direction. I said the war almost never increases liberty. As we were talking about James Madison, at least he didn't decrease it too much during the War of 1812. But the Civil War, Lincoln ruled as a dictator, so he just ran roughshod over the Constitution to save the country, supposedly. But this big war, I'm not sure it really made things better for African Americans. We always take it for granted that they were free, but they were sort of technically free. They still had the black codes, which required them to work on the land of the slaveholders. They got paid a little bit or whatever, but they were still basically slaves, right? And then also we had the Jim Crow later. So I think Martin Luther King was correct that in some respects the African Americans were not freed until the 1960s, which was 100 years after the Civil War, because the Civil War, instead of gradual emancipation, which every other country almost, and certainly every major country that had slavery did, we had a massive Civil War. Well, the South wasn't happy after that, and of course the South ended up winning the peace, because it's sort of like Vietnam. You can't take your military and impose your culture on another country, even if that's a laudable thing in the case of getting rid of slavery. But what other countries did was they just paid for the emancipation of slavery. And Lincoln had advocated that himself, I think in the 1840s. And then after the war started, he started making that argument again. But of course, it was too late. Then the war, everybody was embittered by the war and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the South was embittered by the war afterwards. So we had this meager effect of Reconstruction. But when I say meager, they did attempt to put carpetbagger governments in everywhere, but the U.S. military was very small, demobilized after the war, and Grant really had to threaten South Carolina to keep the South under control. And of course, you had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which not only added slavery to the blacks' problem, but also the fact that they might be killed as well as in their neo-slavery period. So I think it would have been better to negotiate some sort of compensated emancipation where you pay the slave owners. In the end, it would have been much cheaper than the Civil War. But of course, Lincoln was under this impression that the war was going to be over quickly and they were going to, win right away. That's happened many times in U.S. history and world history where people get overconfident about the war. Of course, the war was really catastrophic and probably, including civilians, probably led to about 800,000 casualties. And it's still America's largest war. It left fissures all over the place. It got rid of slavery in name only. And I think it had a lot of detrimental effects towards, it probably slowed down the African Americans' march to real freedom later on. It has to be responsible for some of that. I mean, the winners write the history after war, and so I would say the North won the war, but the South won the peace, and that was unfortunate for the African Americans.
Okay, now you touched on this a little bit at the beginning of your answer, but you have George Washington 7th, whereas most people who put together lists like this would probably have him in the top 2 or 3. So why does Washington rank outside of that top few presidents on your ranking list?
Well, first of all, I think Washington needs to be given credit for not becoming a monarch or even a tyrannical president, because he could have. He was such a hero after the war, and the best thing he ever did was leave after 2 terms. Now that sounds like a damning by faint praise, but in a republic, that norm lasted until FDR broke it in World War II. And so I think that's very valuable in a republic. And George Washington genuinely believed that there should be a transfer of power to new people throughout history. So I think he needs to be given credit for that. Where I rated him down a little bit was he accepted, Jefferson and Hamilton were in his cabinet, and they were vying for his approval for the policies that they want. And those two ended up founding the parties the initial parties that started the American party system. But unfortunately, I think in the second term, he became a Federalist rather than a Democratic Republican on the Jefferson side. And of course, Jefferson was more free market than the Hamiltonians, the Federalists, and they wanted government to subsidize business. Of course, they didn't really realize that could be, or if they did, they didn't care that sort of thing is favoritism, and the government almost never is neutral. It doesn't give out subsidies to all business, gives out subsidies to certain businesses, and distorts the economy and that sort of thing. And it's also much too interventionist. We have a Hamiltonian system now. Hamilton eventually won that, and George Washington, I think, probably started that process by siding with Hamilton. So I think he has to be docked for that. But on the other hand, he didn't become a dictator. He did set some some favorable precedents that were carried on. And I think he was a Republican in the sense that he didn't believe in a constitutional monarchy or any other type of tyranny. He got the republic going, and back then we don't really appreciate how hard that was. I mean, these were states that were coming together, and they had just broken away from Britain, and the whole thing could have gone under in a heartbeat. And I think you have to give credit for George Washington to hold it together. And I think he's probably the only person. His prestige is the only thing that held the country together for the first few years.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.